ക്രൂശും എടുത്തിനി ഞാനൻ യേശുവേ പിൻചെൽകയാ പാരിൽ പരദേശിയായി ഞാൻ മോക്ഷ വീട്ടിൽ പോകയാ ക്രൂശും എടുത്തിനി ഞാനൻ യേശുവേ പിൻചെൽകയാ പാരിൽ പരദേശിയായി ഞാൻ മോക്ഷ വീട്ടിൽ പോകയാ ജീവനൻ പേർക്കായി വേടിഞ്ഞ നാഥനെ ഞാൻ പിൻചെല്ലും എല്ലാരും കൈവിട്ടാലും കൃപയാൽ ഞാൻ പിൻചെല്ലും.
The question is this: how do you reach a generation that listens with its eyes and thinks with its feelings? How do you reach a generation that listens with its eyes and thinks with its feelings? I give you 4 propositions. Number 1, make sure you understand what it means to set apart Christ in your heart as Lord. The lordship of Christ over your will, over your imagination, over your life. The older I get, I talked about speaking in Hyderabad where Rick is. In 1965, I was 19. At the age of 17, I was lying in a hospital room in Delhi. I had never opened a Bible in my life. My parents used to take me to church, and the only thing I did was memorize half of the prayer book, because then I knew how many minutes were left before the service was over. As soon as the vicar would say, "Let us now therefore draw near by faith," I knew we had 7 minutes to go. I couldn't have cared less. I was reading those beautiful prayers and I thought, what on earth does all of this mean? Age 17, when I lost purpose in living, I was in a hospital room. I had tried to poison myself and my body was dehydrated. I'd failed in the attempt, but I was hanging between life and death. A man walked into my room. If this had been 2.5 years ago and I was speaking here, he'd be in the audience. He passed away a couple of years ago. He used to live in Los Angeles. He's an Indian man. He walked into my hospital room and I just looked at him and he said to my mother, "I want to read the Bible to your son." She said, "Whoever let you in here? My son's dying." He said, "Madam, this is what your son needs more than anything else." She said, "You cannot be here. He's in intensive care." He said, "I'm here because I'm a minister." She said, "You cannot be here." He said, "Will you do me a favor and you read it to him?" She said, "Okay, give it to me." My mother's English was not that good, and he had this King James, Gideon's New Testament in his hand. And he gives it to her and turns it to John chapter 14, and in her heavy accented way she's reading. And I'm listening to this because I knew my life was totally a mess. Then she comes to verse 19. Jesus said, "Because I live, you also shall live." Nobody explained it to me. I told my mother to stop there. And I said, "Jesus, if you are the author of life and you want to help me how to live, I will trust you. But I want you to change what I want to do. I don't want to live. If you will change what I want to do, I will leave no stone unturned in my pursuit of truth." I was 17 years old. 5 days later, I walked out of that hospital room so thoroughly converted, setting apart Christ in my heart as Lord. I go to India about 3 times a year. In fact, 2 weeks from now, I'll be in Delhi, speaking there. I always take a taxi, all alone, and I go to the Wellington Hospital. It's called a different name now. And I park outside there, and I just look at that building, and I say to myself, I never dreamed 50 years ago what God had in store for me. And the drivers have no clue what is going on. And one of them, he was a turban guy, a Sikh guy, and he looked at me and he said, "Kya ho raha hai ji? What is happening, sir?" I said, "Ye hamari kahani hai. This is my story." And I tell him what happened. When that Sikh got me back to the hotel where I was staying, he folded his hands and refused to take any money from me. He said, "I've never heard a story like this, and I just want to thank you for not forgetting your roots." I told him, "It is not just my roots, it is a story of my conversion through Jesus Christ, who is now my Lord and my Savior." Set apart Christ in your heart as Lord. What does that mean? It means two things. You know the two greatest commandments. That's what it means. To love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your mind and all your soul and all your strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. But that followed a fascinating conversation. A person tried to trip Jesus up and said to him, "Is it all right to pay taxes to Caesar?" It's one question I so desperately wish Jesus had answered differently. April 15th would be a wonderful day to be godly and rebellious at the same time, Jesus said to him, "Do you have a coin?" He said, "Yes." He said, "Whose image do you see on this?" He said, "Caesar." He said, "Give to Caesar that which belongs to Caesar, and give to God that which belongs to God." A good questioner will always have a follow-up question. And he should have said, "What belongs to God?" And Jesus would have said, "Whose image is on you?" Whose image is on you? Do you know the Judeo-Christian worldview is the only worldview that'll give you that extraordinary credential? I have no right to take a man with a sword in my hand and chop his head off because I'm violating the image of God. I'm fully attacking and assaulting the imago Dei, the image of God. And that vertical gives me the basis for the horizontal. No other worldview gives you this. They either exalt you to deify you or cast you down into the other end of the abyss to make nothing of you. The image of God. And then when he goes on to say, to love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind, and to love your neighbor as yourself, no matter how much we disagree with others, we are taught by Christ to love them. To love them. And you ask any Muslim, chances are 9 out of 10 when you say to them, "How did you come to know Jesus Christ?" A vast majority of them will give you one of two ways. Number one, through a dream. Jesus revealed himself to me through a dream. Or number two, they'll say, "I watched the love of God in another Christian and said, that's what I really don't have." Those are one of two ways. And I've talked to scores of them. There are worldviews astride today that we may not find comfortable within our zones, but I am commanded by God to love my fellow human being, no matter how much I disagree with them. I cannot be disagreeable with patience. If my Lord himself looked at those assaulting him and said, "Father, forgive them because they don't know what they're doing," how much more is it your call and my call to love my fellow human being, even in the face of all such hostility? It's a culture where violence is absolutized and hate has become common. It neither is an option for us. We love our fellow human being with the love of Jesus Christ. All right, so we set apart Christ in our heart as Lord. Secondly, it is very critical we understand that our apologetic will not merely have to be heard, it'll have to be seen. Our apologetic was not merely to be heard, it has to be seen. It has to be visible to people. They are listening with their eyes. They are watching with their eyes. Years ago, my wife and I were visiting Honolulu, and I said to her, "I'd really love to go to the island of Molokai. It's the world's tallest sea cliffs, but I wanted to go there for a reason." I'd read the biography of Damien de Veuster, the Belgian missionary who had gone to Molokai to work with the people in Molokai, the Hawaiians that were sent away there because of leprosy. His brother was commissioned to go, but his brother had suddenly passed away, and so Damien decided he was going to go to take his brother's place. He really didn't want to do it, but he loved his brother and felt that commission had to be fulfilled. So he came. He loved the people. He touched them. He embraced them, built a chapel for them, helped find a cure for them, spent all of his life there. One morning, he was pouring a kettle of boiling water into a cup, and the water swirled out of there and fell onto his bare foot. It took him a moment to realize he couldn't feel it. He was horrified as to what that intimated. He took some more boiling water, poured it gently onto the other foot, and he couldn't feel it. He knew what had happened. That morning, he began his sermon in a different line. He always began by saying, "My fellow believers." That morning, he began by saying, "My fellow lepers." He'd contracted leprosy. So as my wife and I were being shown around with this story, I came to his grave and I said to the man showing me around, "Damien is buried here." He said, "No, sir, he was, but the body was exhumed and the Belgian government asked for him to be brought back." I said, "Oh, wow." They said, "Yep, he was a hero, but the people in Molokai, the people with leprosy," and he taught them to realize they were not lepers, they were people with leprosy. Even though he referred to himself as a leper, he was referring to it purposely as an outcast. He said, "You're not a leper, you're a person with leprosy." Always gave them the dignity of their personhood. And so when they wanted the body back, the people there gathered together and wrote to the Belgian government, "Please, he loved us. This was his home. Don't take his body back from here." But they insisted. So they finally said, "All right, will you cut off that right arm or that right hand and bury it here? It's the hand that touched us." And today in Molokai, in that grave is not his body, it's the hand that reached out and touched them. You know, some time ago when I was being interviewed by India's leading newspaper, The Hindu, they were really quizzing me on why I come there and speak. And then they found out the charitable work they do there. We do that through my daughter's work, Wellspring International. And she looked at me and said, "You're doing this?" I said, "Yeah, we're home for the destitute. We work with prostitutes in the streets. We've got children with AIDS that we're working with, burn victims," and went through all of that. She looked at me and said to me, "I will ever be grateful for what you're doing for your motherland and your homeland." The next day when she wrote the article, there was not one negative word of criticism. It was just a series of appreciations of what was being done for the needy. You see, even the hostile are disarmed when they can see and when they can feel your touch. To you young people especially, I say to you, find some time in your college days, in your school days, to go and touch other people's lives. It'll be the most memorable and the most wonderful thing you're ever doing, and do it in the name of Jesus Christ.
Manam, dhanam, logatnanam, sthanam, sughamidella, labham, allenikkineevan, chedamennarinnu njan. Manam, dhanam, logatnanam,